Since the last video was about the maxillary central incisor, it is only logical that the next video will be about the maxillary lateral incisor. If you missed the previous video, I suggest giving it a watch, since the lateral incisor closely resembles the central incisor. Consequently, I'll be drawing comparisons between the lateral and central incisors multiple times throughout this video. The maxillary lateral incisor is the second tooth from the midline. There are two maxillary lateral incisors. Each one of them is bordered medially by a central incisor and distally by a canine. In the Palmer notation system, they are upper right tooth number 2 and upper left tooth number 2. In the universal system, they are tooth number 7 and tooth number 10. And in the FDI system, they are tooth number 1, 2 and tooth number 2, 2. We can think of the maxillary lateral or second incisor as a smaller, more rounded maxillary central incisor, except for the root, which is taller. Technically supplements the function of the central incisor. Therefore, the main function of the second incisor is incising or cutting the food, supporting the lips, aiding in speech and phonetics, and maintaining the facial aesthetic appearance. Just like the central incisor, the lateral incisor develops from 4 developmental lobes, 3 labial and 1 lingual represented by the cingulum. The first sign of calcification is at 10 to 12 months old, eruption is at 8 to 9 years old, and root completion is around 11 years old. Just like the maxillary central incisor, the crown of the second incisor appears trapezoidal in shape, with a larger base incisally and a narrower base cervically, so it tapers towards the cervix. The crown of this tooth is relatively narrow mesiodistally and shorter cervico-incisally than the maxillary central incisor. The mesial outline of the crown resembles that of the maxillary central incisor, with a more rounded mesio-incisal angle, and the crest of curvature mesially is usually at the junction of the middle and incisal thirds. The distal outline of the crown is always more rounded than that of the maxillary central incisor, and the crest of curvature is more cervical, usually at the center of the middle third. The height of contour tends to go more cervically the further we go posteriorly. The labial surface of the crown is more convex than that of the maxillary central incisor, except in some square and flat-faced forms. The mesial and distal developmental grooves that are made after the fusion of the 3 labial lobes are also present on the facial surface, although they are not as prominent as the developmental grooves on the maxillary central incisor. The apex of the root points distally, just like in the central incisor, but this time it is more pronounced. From the lingual view, the second incisor also does resemble the central incisor. The exception is that its features are more pronounced. For instance, the lingual fossa on the second incisor is much deeper than the lingual fossa of the central incisor. Mesial and distal marginal ridges are noticeable, so is the linguo-incisal edge. The cingulum is centered rather than distally displaced, like on the central incisor. From a side view, the crown of the tooth appears triangular in shape, with the base at the cervix. The facial and lingual heights of contours are in the cervical third. The facial outline is convex from the CEJ to the height of contour, then it is straight or slightly convex. The lingual outline is convex over the cingulum, then concave. The cervical outline is concave towards the apex. It is more pronounced on the mesial aspect when compared to the distal aspect. Usually the mesial cervical line is 1 mm deeper. A line drawn in the center of the tooth would bisect both the root apex and the incisal edge. The proximal contact and the height of the CEJ also fall on this imaginary line. From the incisal view, the tooth appears ovoid in shape. We can notice that the mesiodistal width and the labiolingual length are approximately the same. We also can notice that the mesiodistal dimensions of the facial are greater than the mesiodistal dimensions of the lingual. Thus, from the incisal view, the tooth tapers to the lingual. The mesial and distal marginal ridges are noticeable, so is the centered cingulum. The lateral incisor has 1 root, with 1 canal. 3 pulp horns are present, except when there is a peg lateral, then there is 1 pulp horn. We will talk about the peg lateral in a bit. A cross-section at the mid-root is oval. The second incisor is the second most likely tooth to be malformed, after the king of malformation, the third molar. Let's start with the peg lateral. In this case, the tooth is smaller than normal. and conical in shape. It happens in 2% of the population, so it is fairly common. Sometimes, the mesial and distal marginal ridges extend far at the cingulum, creating a small pit called the lingual pit. This pit is hard to clean and scale, and food can accumulate there, so it increases the risk of decay. Placing sealant there is beneficial. There sometimes is a palato-lingual or a palato-radicular groove that extends from the fossa down to the root. This one is also difficult to clean and scale, and the risk of caries is significantly higher, especially on the root. Other variations include having a tubercle on the cingulum, dens invaginatus, or even the tooth being entirely missing.